So those of you that are online or actually in the room, so I'm Howard Bondell, if you don't know, one of the chief investigators in Optima, and it's my pleasure to introduce David Ceddia, who is a PhD student with myself and Peter Taylor as co-supervisor. So David is talking about mathematical modeling and optimization of athletic performance. So David's actually just in first year, finishing first year?
Finish into the second year.
And so into the second year now.
Yeah, been confirmed. Yeah. Thank you, Howard, and thank you everyone for attending. So before I dive into the mathematical modeling and optimization of athletic performance, I'd like to take a moment to cover some motivation. Why are we interested in having a mathematical model of athletic performance? What range of questions could we hope to pose to that model, and what type of benefits could we get from that? So to establish the motivation, I'm going to cover 3 papers, the first of which are midlife cardiorespiratory fitness and the long-term risk of mortality, 46 years of follow-up. So in this study, a total of 5,107 men were followed for 46 years. During that period, 92% of those men died, 42.1% of them died of cardiovascular disease. The punchline of this paper is that for each unit increase in VO2 max was associated with a 45-day increase in longevity. For those of you who don't know what VO2 max is, it's basically a metric to quantify how well your heart and lungs can power you through exercise or activity. Second paper, age-associated declines in muscle mass, strength, power, and physical performance impact on fear of falling and quality of life. So the punchline of this paper, in older adults with and without mobility limitations, declining muscle mass, strength, power, and physical performance contribute independently to increased fear of falling, whilst declines of muscle mass and physical performance contribute to deterioration of quality of life. So the intuition behind this paper is that you need, as you begin to age, you still need to retain sufficient athletic performance to perform necessary tasks of life. So things like being able to get out of bed in the morning, sit down and stand up from the toilet, shower and dress yourself, and transport yourself around, potentially to see friends and family. And if you experience a decline in your physical performance and a decline in your ability to do those activities, then you might experience a deterioration in quality of life. So the third paper, this one, health benefits of exercise. Overwhelming evidence exists that lifelong exercise is associated with a longer health span, delaying the onset of 40 chronic conditions and diseases. So we can take a look at a table of those 40 conditions. This is worsening of 40 conditions caused by the lack of physical activity with growth, maturation, and aging throughout lifespan. Some select items: accelerated biological aging and premature death, breast cancer, cognitive dysfunction, coronary heart disease, depression and anxiety, immunity, osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, pain, stroke. So the idea I'm trying to convey here is that if we are really trying to have longer, better quality lives where we're free of chronic conditions and maintain that quality into our later years, some degree of athletics performance or concerns regarding athletic performance is relevant. Indeed, we don't necessarily want to, in the pursuit of doing something good, hurt ourselves either. So what types of questions can we pose to an athletics performance model? Well, we can ask things such as, what training program will maximize my VO2 max improvement over the next 6 weeks? So if you're an elite athlete preparing for an event, you could hope to maximize your performance for that event. You could equally pose, if I want to increase my VO2 max by 1 unit over 6 weeks, for the purposes of longevity, say, you're after that 45 days, what is the minimum amount of training that I must do? You can't necessarily keep improving forever. There will be a plateau and a decrease in returns at some point. If I want to maintain my performance that is sufficient, what is the minimum amount of training necessary to achieve that? So now that we feel properly motivated of why we might want it and what we would do with it, we need to actually have this model. And this is just a sketch at this point. So I'm building up to what the model will be. So if we were to necessarily start with a fundamental consideration of all the relevant contributions, all the relevant biological mechanisms, and how they interact. We're going to have to keep track of a lot of things. So for instance, I've sketched that we would need to keep track and have knowledge of the state of all the muscles, tendons, ligaments, bones, organs, hormones, energy stores, immune system, nervous system, gut health, etc. Once we have knowledge of all these things, we want to keep track of how they're evolving in time, notionally as we eat, train, and sleep. And then we would have some performance prediction, and that would be some complex mapping, which depends on what task we're trying to do, how psychologically motivated we are to excel at that, what equipment is available, and what the environment is doing. What's the weather? Is it hot, cold, windy, etc. My point with all this is that if you really were to come with a bottom-up approach, it would be hugely complicated, and there's lots of things to consider and lots of relationships to consider. It would be largely impractical, unwieldy as a model, and almost practically impossible to do. So we're not necessarily going to come from a bottom-up approach. We're going to come from a top-down approach. We're going to come up with a few abstract ideas and relationships to try and capture the dominant dynamics. So repeating what I was just saying, our aim is to construct the simplest reasonable model of athletics performance, which maps a training load to an expected change in performance. And as I said, I'm only considering training and change in performance. I'm necessarily going to neglect all other factors such as diet, sleeping habits, what your psychology, physiology, to some extent, what the weather and equipment is. So we're going to assume they're either held constant, which is a reasonable assumption in many cases, or it contributes to some error in the model. I'd just like to emphasize that predicting a final performance is a necessary part of the process of what we're doing here, but ultimately we're trying to determine optimal training loads. So we want a mathematical model to inform our decisions and behaviors, and the decisions and behaviors in preparation for an event or in achieving an outcome is our training, not necessarily the performance itself. So with all of those introductory points said, I think we're finally ready to meet our first mathematical model of athletics performance from the literature. This is the Banister et al. 1975 fitness fatigue impulse response model. Broadly, what this is doing is saying that a predicted performance on day N is equal to a baseline performance plus a summation over our training history. For each training event, we need to quantify a training amount. Once we've done that, we will convert the training amount into an expected change in performance. That change in performance then needs to be time propagated from the day that it was completed to the day being considered, where we're trying to predict our performance on that day. Elaborating on those terms, the Banister summarized a training session in a single value known as a training impulse W. What that is essentially an integration over the duration of your training session, where it could be an integration or a summation, and each increment that contributes to the integral or summation is dilated by an intensity factor. So if you're training very hard, it's a large contribution. If you're barely training at all, it's next to zero contribution. In practice, this is done usually using a heart rate ratio, but it could be done using a power output, a velocity, a distance thrown, height jumped, weight lifted. So in practice, it's quite diverse, but the takeaway idea here is that there is a single value which summarizes each training session, and that value we can put in as W for each training session. Okay, once we quantify the amount of training completed in a session, we then need to convert it into an expected change in performance. So we're going to have two flow-on effects for our change in performance, a positive change in performance, which we're notionally going to call fitness, capital F, and the simplest model that we could hope to adopt is just to say that they're linearly proportional, that some fraction of my training load is going to change or be converted into a positive change in performance, and some fraction of my training load will contribute to a negative change in performance, fatigue, which will denote lowercase f, and has a negative K2 relationship. So once we've completed that expected change in performance, we then need to time propagate. So if I do a training session, generate some fatigue, I will expect to recover in time. So I would expect my fatigue to decay over time. A natural choice of decaying function is exponential. Similarly, I do a training session, generate some benefit over time, over a longer period of time than my fatigue recovery. I would expect to eventually incur detraining, and that also will begin to decay. So we have a second decaying function to propagate that. Expressing this all graphically, I think it, for my own sake, makes a lot more sense once I've seen the graph or the graphical process. We go through each individual training session and we integrate across that duration, and each increment is dilated by an intensity to give the training impulse. That training impulse then gives rise to a positive fitness response, yellow, and a negative fatigue response in orange. These each decay in time going forwards. You can take the summation of these two components to get the combined response. That's my expected change in performance in response to that individual training session. And I can go ahead and do that for my entire history of training. And I can pick, say, the last day, sum up all the prior contributions to get an expected change in performance, add that to my baseline level, and I'll get a predicted performance for any given day that I'm interested in. So it's a graphical representation. This is the analytical representation. Again, just quickly, this is the predicted performance on day n is equal to a baseline performance at the start of my modeling window, plus a summation of my training history. Each training amount is quantified by the training impulse Wi, is then converted into an expected change in performance by K1 and K2. And these are then time propagated by the decaying exponentials from day I to day n. And that is the Banister model. We have the fitness, fatigue, impulse response components. And we might be interested now to ask the question, is this a good model? Can I use this model to answer the questions I posed at the start of the talk? Could I get an optimal training load to maximize my VO2 max, or any of the other questions? In the literature, people have attempted to answer this question, is it a good model? And the approach that they've taken is to say, well, we're going to go out into the real world, take some training load data with some people, take some change in performance data, come back and try and see if I can take an appropriate choice of parameters and match up the predicted performance to the observed performance. And if there is a good matchup between those two, it's a good model. And if they don't match up very well, it's not a very good model. In practice, it does reasonably well. This model, they calculate a coefficient of determination, which is a measure of the squared error. And it gets roughly 80% explanatory in a number of papers. There's been over 20 papers doing this over a range of sports. And that seems promising, but that's, again, not quite what we're after. We're after training loads, not necessarily performances. So we're going to adopt a different perspective. We're going to say, we're going to start with our athletics performance model, and we're going to ask the question, what is the optimal training load which maximizes my performance over a fixed period, and look at that optimized training load and look at trends present in there and ask if those trends compare or match to what is done in practice by elite athletes. So we would hope to see things like moderation, periodization, and tapering. To sort of further elaborate on that, I've included here an example. So this is Olympic champion, world champion, and world record holder Jacob Ingebrigtsen. He's a middle distance runner from Norway, another N country. From Norway. This is his training load in the lead up to the 2024 Paris Olympics. So you don't necessarily need to take away all of the features. It's the blue curve, the blue plot, or the blue line. We're seeing peaks and troughs on small scales, peaks and troughs on larger scales. There's a linear taper in towards the end event, towards the Olympics. But notably, it's not consistent. It's not train as hard as you can all the time. There's a variation in what people are aiming to do. So returning to the math, so we can take our Banister model and we're going to seek the training load W, which maximizes our performance on day N, subject to the constraints that I can't have a negative training load. And K2WI is the amount of fatigue that I generate in a training session. Fatigue is not necessarily how tired you are. It's got a strict definition, and that is the loss of performance. And I can't lose more performance than I had to begin with. So that represents an upper bound on how much training we can complete. We can then go to the literature and pick out realistic parameters and solve this optimization problem. This is an example for doing that. First inspection, we can see that it's not quite what elite athletes did in practice. It's fairly consistent in its behavior. It's train every day as hard as you can, right up to this upper boundary for the first 26 days, then you get 2 days off. And somewhat maybe encouragingly, or maybe somewhat alarmingly, the performance has gone from roughly 100 to over 6,000, a more than 600 times multiplier of the original performance. So we would have serious doubts as to whether this is a realistic prediction of performance, and serious doubts as to whether this is a type of training load that we want to actually put into practice. You might say, well, maybe this is just a very poor choice of parameters, but I've actually tried this for randomly picking parameters within a feasible range and done this over 1 million times and checked it against the trend of train as hard as you can while the impulse response is making positive return, then do 0 training. And it always shows this general trend of behavior regardless of parameters. So we might have hoped that the model would have 2 antagonistic players, that we're in pursuit of fitness, but it costs us fatigue, and we would have to balance these 2 forces, and it would lead to some sort of complex behavior. But seemingly in this construction, it's not quite enough. So we feel motivated that we're going to need more. Fortunately, people have done more in the literature. So we can meet the Busso 2003 variable dose response model. Busso's model is very similar to the Banister model. It just has a nonlinear fatigue response. So what that means, in effect, is that there's a memory attached to your fatigue response. If you've trained a lot recently, then on the given day of training, you're going to have a larger fatigue response. And if you haven't trained much recently, your fatigue response on that given day is going to be lower. So again, we can take this model, set up the optimization problem, and see what it predicts as far as optimized training loads. So the same as before, we seek the training load, which maximizes our performance on day N, subject to the constraint, no negative training, and we can't generate more fatigue than we have performance. However, we run into a problem if we just set this up the same as before. As I just mentioned about the memory effect on the fatigue response, there's a loophole attached to that, which is if I just wait long enough, or indeed start in a very fresh state, my fatigue response can be made arbitrarily small, could be made 0 even, in which case I generate no fatigue as part of training. I could potentially do infinite training and make infinite performance gains. So this problem's unbounded and quite unrealistic. So there's a number of mathematical fixes that one could employ for that. But what we've done is say, well, there's a reasonable upper bound, arbitrary upper cap that we're going to put on the training load and solve it for this simple intervention. So the training load is down here on the bottom right graph. It's doing something on first observation, doing something different to the Banister model. It's not a train as hard as you can every single day anymore. It's having some on-off days. That seems promising. However, on closer inspection, we start this first day, we have we're starting fresh, we have no memory of recent training. So then we train as hard as we can right up to the arbitrary upper cap, and our performance goes from roughly 100 to over 200, more than 2 times multiplier. So a really fantastic first day of training, probably not corresponding to what we would expect to be the outcome of a really hard day of training. If you went out and ran a marathon, you don't wake up the next day ready to run it 2.5 times faster. You wake up the next day very sore with a really decreased performance as opposed to drastically increased. And then the model says, well, my fatigue response now has a memory of a very hard training session, so I need to wait until that's sort of dissipated. So I take 5 days off, and then this process repeats, and I train very hard again. So this solution is really being determined quite strongly by our arbitrary choice of upper cap, which is maybe sensibly chosen, but not what you want to be having a strong impact on the optimized training load. This response and behavior with the nonlinear fatigue response is not sort of desirable. So again, we can sort of think perhaps this is not quite the intervention we wanted. We are going to have to try and be more creative. So this raises the big question, what nonlinearities can we add to the Banister model, which is our baseline case, it's linear, a Banister model of athletic performance to elicit optimized training load trends that match what elite athletes do in practice. For example, the moderation, periodization, and tapering responses. So let's introduce some ideas and then we'll turn them into the math. So suppose training becomes less effective as a training session is continued. So this is sort of a parent idea to that you would get saturation of various avenues of improvement. So if you start a training session, you might go through initial stages of performance improvement due to a warm-up. But once you've been through a warm-up, you can't then do a second and a third and a fourth and continue to compound warm-ups. You've just done your warm-up and that's been saturated as a mechanism and is no longer available to you as a performance improvement, and so on for other various avenues. So this can be, that's a saturation effect, but saturation effects are a subset of diminishing returns. So the Banister model says, regardless of where I'm up to, all training throughout the session just gives a K1 proportional response. We can say actually the effectiveness of training decays as I continue to train. In this case, this saturates at a K3 value. So my training session at most could be K3, and then K1 of that is benefit, which I will keep. You can put that into the model. And it's still some hard training to begin with, but now we've introduced a more nuanced tapering effect. Now we have a linear taper for the last 2 weeks leading into the event. So if we have diminishing returns, we can get tapering out of our model. And indeed, exponential diminishing returns is not the only kind of returns that we could have, not the only kind of decay that we could have, sorry. You could have a power law decay, logistic step down in its benefit, and each of these will bring about a different optimal tapering behavior. So that's just an interesting note or thing to be aware of. Another idea, this is sort of building off the last idea. Suppose training becomes less effective if it's completed whilst fatigued. So now we're building off the last idea and supposing that I still have various avenues of improvement saturated from the previous training session, and I haven't fully recovered from it in the current training session, so I can't again hope to compound on top of those and get that same improvement. So I've reduced capacity in today's session because I trained very hard last session, say. So Banister has an insensitive setup to this, that regardless of what I did yesterday, it's always just K1 times the training amount of training you do. But we can set up, well, actually, there's some offset and decay depending on how fatigued I still am. So we can again do the optimization. This is 2 plots of the training load, optimized training load for different values of K4, which is a representative of how sensitive we are to fatigue. If K4 is very low, we have a high sensitivity to fatigue and we would train not very often. If K4 is quite large, then we have a higher tolerance for fatigue. We can build up more fatigue before it decays our benefit. We can train more often and sustain greater levels of fatigue throughout our training. Still quite hard training in both cases, but various levels of periodization coming into the model now. One final effect to consider, time constant changes. So suppose larger training impulses have a longer lasting effect. The idea being captured here is that if I do a warm up, it's a sort of small training session that will have an effect which lasts 20 minutes, an hour at most, say. If I do a very large training session, the types of physical mechanisms which are incurred or maybe the type of biological damage and tissue that's been damaged in that process will have a slower recovery rate and slower detraining rate. So currently Banister says regardless of the size of training, it always decays at the same rate. And we're saying actually the decay rate is going to depend on how large the training session was. If I did a larger training session, it's going to decay more slowly. If I introduce that effect, then the optimization changes to at the start of my training session, or sorry, at the start of my training period for the full 4 weeks, I'm interested in doing hard training, which is going to generate a long-lasting effect and is still relevant by the final day. And then as I get closer to the final event, I'm no longer interested in generating such long-lasting effects, and I can afford to train at a lower level, although it's still very hard, and then I taper into the final event. And again, I don't necessarily need to have just a linear change in my decay constant. It could be, in general, a power law here, or we have a slower, more gradual change with a logarithmic expression, or make it logistic, and this will change the optimized training behavior. For instance, most notably in the taper goes from linear to an exponential taper to a step down taper, depending on what functional choice you make. Okay. So far, we've shown that the existing athletics performance models do not display practical or realistic training load behavior under optimization. They're not necessarily models that, or predictions that we're interested in putting into practice. We've explored several nonlinearities which introduce tapering and periodization, which are the right sort of trends that we hope to see, but still it wasn't quite the same as the example that we saw from Jacob Ingebrigtsen. So we still had this problem of often training as hard as we possibly could when it was time to train. There wasn't necessarily much moderation, much consideration of whether an individual has the capacity to do that training session. So we think perhaps we're still missing something, perhaps that is injury risk. So we can take a breath here. This is sort of the end of the first chapter, and then we're going to dive into a new injury risk consideration component for the next part. Okay, so we're going to jump back to the literature. So I want to introduce you to Blanche and Gabbett's acute to chronic workload injury risk. And in this study or paper, they've got, has the athlete trained enough to return to play safely? The acute to chronic workload ratio permits clinicians to quantify a player's risk of subsequent injury. Punchline of this paper is a figure. In this figure, we have on the y-axis likelihood of subsequent injury, and on the x-axis acute to chronic workload ratio. I should define what the acute to chronic workload ratio is. So the acute workload is the 7-day average of your training. The chronic workload is a 4-week average, and the ratio being a 1-week to 4-week average of your training. And they stated that to minimize injury risks, practitioners should aim to maintain the acute to chronic workload ratio within a range of approximately 0.8 to 1.3, or as the figure suggests, within the sweet spot green region for minimizing injury risk. So we can go ahead and put this into our optimization problem. And we're going to consider just the Banister model. So the Banister model has in it the idea that more training is beneficial. And now we're trying to counterbalance the more training is beneficial with the idea that, well, too much training is going to injure ourselves. So we're again seeking the training load W, which maximizes our performance, subject to the constraint that I can't do negative training, can't generate more fatigue than I have performance. But now my acute training load, my 7-day average, must lie within 0.8 to 1.3 of my 4-week average. which corresponds to the Blanch-Gavitt's recommendations. So if we put this in place, on face value, it seems like quite an improvement. We've gone from train as hard as you can every single day for 26 days, then we get 2 days off, to something significantly more moderated, which is what we hope to set out to achieve. So that's a partial success. If we take a closer inspection, we're getting these peaks occurring on a 7-day period. And those peaks are corresponding to the fact that we've got a 7-day rolling average in place for our acute workload definition. And whilst that's practical, that we live in a society on a 7-day period with weeks, we wouldn't necessarily want our optimized training load behavior to be so dominantly governed by that choice. For instance, I could choose that my acute training load be defined as 1 day, 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, 9 days, and the location of these peaks will vary depending on that choice. And it's not necessarily motivated by something underlying physiological reason. It's just what in practice we found to be empirically reasonable. A second sort of maybe criticism of this approach or result that we've got is that we've treated all of the acute to chronic workload ratios within 0.8 to 1.3 as acceptable. And the optimization algorithm has said, well, I'll just make that as the maximum that I can. I will make that 1.3 for as much as I can. And it doesn't necessarily have a much nuance as far as the injury risk is concerned. So that's decided to exit from full screen. Return to full screen. We can move on. Let's return to full screen. We can move on from Blanch and Gavitt. There's other recommendations for training load management. A very common one, which people use in practice, is to restrict their changes in training to within a 10% range of what they've done before. So any given training session can't be more than 10% of what I've done before. And my weekly average can't exceed 10% of a week prior to what I've done. Okay, so we can put that in the optimization. If you put in the daily 10% limit, it reduces the exponential growth to being 10%. The weekly limit, again, these have all achieved moderation. We're getting a similar sort of result as before with the Blanch and Gavitt recommendations, and similarity is that we still have a rolling 7-day average impacting the solution. And then the peaks get moderated from the weekly limit to the daily and weekly limit. So as far as practically speaking, as long as you've got some period of training prior to enacting these constraints, and that period of training is reasonable, it comes out as a much a moderated program. It's on a 7-day basis, which is convenient. There are some benefits here, but again, as far as an optimization is concerned, it's undesirable that these peaks are occurring every 7 days. And there's quite an insensitivity to, we would hope to do better than, say. So one last thing that we can do, we can return to Blanch and Gavitt, and not only do they have this recommendation with the sweet spot and danger zone, but they've also fitted a parabola to their data. Data has something of a spread, a coefficient of determination of 0.53, but nonetheless they have an explicit parabolic expression to predict the likelihood of subsequent injury. And we can take that explicit expression and put that into the optimization, and now we can seek the training load which maximizes my expected performance. My expected performance in this context is my final performance multiplied by the probability that I don't injure myself on any of the days while I'm training. If I did injure myself, then the whole endeavor is, thrown to the side. So I maximize expected performance subject to the same constraints as before, and now we have an explicit representation for our injury risk, which depends on the acute to chronic workload ratio. And we can go ahead and put that into the optimization algorithm. similar to before, but slightly different. Again, 7-day artifacts corresponding to a 7-day rolling average. What's interesting to note is the acute to chronic workload ratio is being, we might start our training sessions trying to pursue gains and improvements, and it seemingly allows a higher acute to chronic workload ratio at the start, but it drives that down to something more consistent, closer to 1. The variation in the acute to chronic workload ratio is getting less as the time goes on. The probability of injury is also getting less as time goes on the very far right graph. But if we actually look at the training load that it's recommending, it's almost in effect concentrating all of our training onto a single day for a whole week. The reason being the acute to chronic workload ratio is when it does a 7-day average, it's completely insensitive as to whether that was done on a day or spread out over that week in some reasonable fashion. So whilst our probability of injury is getting more uniform, our actual training load is getting more variable. And we might have suspicions or doubt as to whether that's reasonable or desirable. So having looked at that, we can maybe move on to introducing our own model for injury risk. So we thought a reasonable baseline structure was to model the probability of injury using a modified logistic representation. So for example, just notionally, I can set out and do some training up to some threshold in a very safe way. Once I exceed that threshold, I start to incur some risk of injury. And if I really keep pushing myself, I'll almost certainly injure myself. And as a technical note, what do I mean by modified logistic representation? Well, it's just a standard logistic representation, a standard curve S-bend. But I want that the probability of injuring myself due to training, given I do no training, it should be 0. So you should pass through the 0 point. And since you've shifted a standard logistic representation down slightly, and this is a cumulative probability distribution, you just renormalize so that it does go to 1 in the asymptote. With that in mind, moving back to the narrative, we're taking this, the game we're going to play is we're taking this representation for injury risk, and we're going to say that we can generate some injury robustness due to fitness. Move my cursor. So for a given training session, I can be less likely to injure myself if I gain fitness. I'll have the curve move to the left. If I incur fatigue, so for a same previously safe training session, if I'm quite fatigued, it could be quite a high probability of injury. And then I can play the scenario where I have it moving to the right with increased fitness and moving to the left with increased fatigue in a very dynamical way as training is completed. So we can go through each of these 4 scenarios. So assume that we just have this static injury risk profile, which doesn't change with our fitness and fatigue response. And the Banister model says that we should start at some appropriate threshold and then just slowly, gradually increase our training. This is not because we're getting fitter per se. This is because training is considered to be more effective as you get to within this region of the final date. Like we can see that the consideration taking place is that we're almost trading off an increased injury risk to do this extra training, but that extra training is of greater benefit, again, because training is modeled as a decaying function. Basically, if we can do it within a region where our fatigue decays off, but our fitness doesn't, then this is a sort of optimally efficient region. But if we add in that our profile for injury risk moves to the right as we gain fitness, we can get a very similar looking training load graph where we gradually increase from some threshold, but we've gained the fitness to sustain that in a reasonably safe way. The next one to consider is what if the profile for injury moves to the left, or if we get more injury susceptible if we're quite fatigued. If we introduce that, now we generate periodization into our solution. So now we have multiple mechanisms for periodization. interesting to note. And then we can add in both that we move to the right with fitness, to the left with fatigue. And we start off, the first day we're not very fatigued, so we do maybe a hard training session, then we do incur fatigue. From that point on, we're gradually increasing our on days, but keeping our injury risks relatively consistent. And eventually we generate enough fitness that even our off days turn into easy days, which then sort of gradually ramp up as we generate more and more fitness. And we ramp down towards our final event. 441. I had a slightly more realistic example, which maybe I'll return to in questions. But it's a different choice of parameters and it gives a slightly more realistic result. But let's start to summarize. Okay, so on a mathematical front, we've adopted the perspective of training load optimization as an avenue for guiding the formulation of athletic performance models. We have coupled injury risk mitigation recommendations from the literature with athletics performance models. I've never seen that done before. As far as I know, this is the first time that coupling of the two ideas has been performed. We've even gone so far as to propose our own injury risk model, which naturally uses the same observable quantities that we've used in our athletics performance modeling. And we put those two together. Those are some new ideas that we've covered. Some takeaway ideas if you're interested on the athletics performance front. If you're an elite athlete trying to maximize your performance, or you're thinking about going out there and doing some exercise, it would be great if we were ready. We had these models available in an app form that you can go out and use, but we're not quite there yet. But still, the ideas covered in the talk is that we still have the Banister model, which covered ideas that training is the dominant contribution to changing performance, but we really have to balance pursuing more training with injury risk considerations, that the whole endeavor is kind of not worthwhile if we go out and do ourselves harm. We've explored likely causes of injury, and I think it's maybe easiest to understand these scenarios when looking with this reference point. So there are maybe 3 scenarios which are likely injury risks. So imagine you go out to do a training session and you're doing a training session you've done before. You're thinking to yourself, I know I can do this. I've done it before. But that was maybe six weeks ago, 6 months ago, 6 years ago. And the fitness you did have at that time has subsided in the elapsing time, and you're not really willing to admit to yourself that you've slightly regressed. And then you inadvertently push yourself beyond the sort of safe training regime and into a higher risk. A second scenario in which you might injure yourself would be that you're doing a training session that you've done before, and you tell yourself, I know I can do this, but you only did it yesterday or 2 days ago. And whilst you didn't injure yourself yesterday or 2 days ago, from that training session, you might have generated some fatigue, which has brought your threshold lower, and suddenly repeating that same training session becomes a more risky event for you. Not necessarily you're going to injure yourself. The third scenario in which you might injure yourself due to training is when you come and you just say, today I'm going to try and reach new heights never before reached by me before, and you just send it right off the deep end, and then you're probably not guaranteed to hurt yourself, but you're running a risk.
So you just be unlucky.
Could just be unlucky. Yeah, you could roll your ankle on a tree root. You could be struck by lightning. Any of those things which are not predicted in this model. So those are the primary concerns. More training is good, but injuring yourself is bad. You need to balance those two factors. Of a secondary balance, we think that there's likely diminishing returns or some sort of saturation effect associated as ongoing training is completed. However, the types of returns that you're getting with increased training are likely a longer lasting effect in the change of performance. So there's probably some optimal balance you could strike there. The idea I want to leave you with is that there's a context dependency of optimality. The best thing for you to do depends on what you have done, whether you've been doing not much recently, a lot recently. Are you currently feeling fresh from that, fatigued from that? And then when do you want to be at your best? Have you got an upcoming event which you need to be fresh for? Or is it okay for you to sustain some sort of fatigue going forwards? But yes, it sort of depends. That a consistent answer is not always going to be the right answer in this case. As far as what's coming next, so we're currently working on turning the deterministic model of athletic performance into a stochastic model. So we're not going to just say this is the expected change in performance, but we're hoping to have a confidence interval on that prediction, that it would be within certain range. Once we've got a stochastic model, we can hope to employ Bayesian inference and hierarchical Bayesian inference for the purposes of parameter estimation. Parameter estimation in this context is quite difficult. We would not necessarily hope to have a whole lot of training data and change of performance data for any given individual. Even worse so is a whole lot of training data and injury data for any given individual. So you're going to be looking at populations and then hoping to infer from the population dynamics what an individual might be doing. And in this context, Bayesian inference, hierarchical Bayesian inference is going to be a very valuable tool. Ultimately, we hope to be able to package all of this up into something that would be useful to be included in activity tracking watches and apps and available for people to use and inform their decision making. So last thing, I'd like to thank my supervisors, Professor Howard Bondell and Professor Peter Taylor, for their support. I'd like to thank Optima for this opportunity to present this seminar. And I'd like to thank Elizabeth and Veron Poonsey for their funding. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone who attended virtually and in person. Thank you for listening.